Why do we read? Many reasons. We read to be entertained, to be stimulated, to be frightened, to solve mysteries with Kathy Reichs or P.D. James. We read to escape to some far-off land, to run on a dog sled through the Arctic, climb Mount Kilimanjaro, or sail across the Atlantic in a sailboat. We read for comfort. Kate Morton, in her book, The Forgotten Garden, tells us that the power of stories have the magic ability to heal the wounded part of a body. Also, we read totally to escape what's happening to us today. And yet we also read to learn. But where do books come from? How does it all happen? How does the writer's idea get from the head into the book and into the hands of the reader? In other words, how are books born?
It depends on where the idea comes from. Often it comes from seeing a person. I get the person in my mind, and the rest of the book comes around that. I very seldom start a novel with a plot. The plot comes with the people. I do my first draft in longhand in Hilroy notebooks. After I have a first draft, no matter how rough it is, I put it on the computer. I then take my printed copy and start revision. I always do the second revision in longhand, the complete thing, even if it means that I'm just copying some parts without actually doing any rewriting. I then put those changes on the computer and print out another copy. All of that would probably take about 3 or 4 months. I would then do the third and fourth drafts, and that involves really tweaking things, sometimes rewriting complete paragraphs, and probably in about 6 months I could have a finished novel.
It depends on what the project is, or what the book or the poem is about. If it's a real historical event, then you probably want to begin with research. Find out exactly what happened, or read about the people involved, get an understanding of the personalities, a feeling for the location, the place, and you'll want to take notes. Some of them will be factual, some of them will be little imagistic snippets, a few lines of poetry that occur to you, and you're going to assemble all of this later. Then there's the other kind of poem where you're inspired by something in the natural world or something that's happened to you. You don't have to do the research. And there the process is probably working the other way. The beauty or the insight or whatever, the thing that's poetic about it already exists. And you're going to put that into your notes and then add the sense, the structure. You're going to try to put it together and rewrite it until it makes sense to other people as well as to your insular self.
My kind of writing, which is biting off a little piece of my life. I've always thought it's like when you're sewing. You bite off a little piece of thread. You don't have scissors handy, so you bite off a little piece of thread and then you stitch it. Well, that's exactly what I do. I bite off a little piece of my life and then I send it off. I had a great deal of puzzle about why I had the kind of childhood and life I had afterwards. It didn't really become clear to me till my 50s, and I think for most people, your 50s is your sorting out time. It's all right to leave it till then, too. Then you're saying, what was it all about? They always say the person's first book is largely autobiographical, and that's probably true. But you've got to get it out somehow, the stories that made you you, before you go on to something else. You have to have that security of knowing who you are. So I think that there's nothing like writing to find out who you are.
I work a little differently. I have a co-author named Gina Buonaguro who lives in Toronto, and we've now written 2 books together. It's a difficult process to describe. It's probably easier to tell you what it isn't rather than what it is. The thing we don't do is we don't sit down at the computer together and look over each other's shoulders. I think that would drive us both quite insane. We start by talking, And so before we go our separate ways, we have a really good idea of the projects that we're working on. And it usually just starts with something that we're inspired by. I might try a conversation between two different characters, and she may try to describe a very separate scene. And once we've gone as far as we figure we can on our own, then we exchange and we look at each other's work, we comment on it, we send it back. Sometimes when we send it back, nothing of the original work even exists other than maybe the germ of the idea. But it goes back and forth until we agree that it's the best it can possibly be. And of course, being two authors, we bring both of our experiences together, our travels, our lives, our education, our interests, and I think that it makes the story branch off in ways that would never have happened if we were writing on our own.
When I'm writing a magazine story, I often think of something that my father told me, and that is that my father was a magazine editor and author named Sandy Ross, or Alexander Ross was his byline. He always said that each magazine story that he wrote, he thought of it as a little book, a short book, by which he meant that it needs a beginning and an end and a middle and a narrative thread or arc and characters and drama and conflict and so on. Each book will evolve in a different way. Sometimes it'll come out of your head and you'll write it on spec, which means you don't get paid anything until it's, they can say yes or no to it. Sometimes a publisher will come to you. Sometimes, I don't know, sometimes it comes to you as a gift from, the cosmos. I mean, you'll find something and you're the only person in the world who can write that book. Marilyn Simons wrote a book called The Convict Lover because she found some old letters in an attic in her house, and that were written between an inmate in Kingston pen and a young girl who lived in that house. And Marilyn, was a later tenant of that house, and her finding those letters, it's almost like, the cosmos saying, here, this is your book, write it. It has to be you. And Marilyn did, and it's a great book.
I always start with characters. Without characters, you don't have anything else. It's people who have to do something. It's whatever action you might like your characters to do. You still have to start with the characters. It's always people. It's people who fuel the story. It's people who drive the story. It's people who do everything that makes the story a story. Like most writers, I have a certain set number of words or number of pages that I regard as my daily work, and until that's finished, I don't stand up again. I write first thing in the morning because I am the absolute queen of procrastination, and if I don't write right away, I won't write.
Getting it down on paper is only the beginning. Once I'm happy with a story, for instance, I would then go to someone I respect, a friend who's in the writing business, or a writer-in-residence, for instance. Helen Humphreys was at Queen's this year and looked at a story with me. And she was able to discern things that I hadn't seen, of course, because she didn't have a jaundiced eye. And she would suggest that the story was pretty well intact, except that the ending should go back to the main character, and I had stopped a bit short. And so I was able, after that meeting with her, to go away and not take everything that she said absolutely as God-given, but to really apply what she had said about the ending. So I finished the story, and I actually sent it away in the mail 6 months after that meeting with Helen, and I sent it out to the Walrus magazine, and who knows?
It's hard to believe that once the hard work of writing is done, then the real work begins. How do you get a book published? What happens now? How do writers get their work published?
In terms of looking for a possible publishing house, There are a number of market books available. Quill and Quire is a good source of market information. I found the publisher for my first novel in a writing magazine. I found the publisher for my first mystery, my current book, by going to the bookstore and going down the aisles and looking at who was publishing what. And when I came upon Signature Editions, I didn't realize that they published as many genres as they did. So I thought I would try Signature Editions, and it turned out to be a successful submission. I remember I mailed the manuscript December 7th, and on December 15th I had a reply. It then took another year before I received the phone call one day. I was just about to send a letter to inquire about the status of the manuscript when I received a phone call from a very nice sounding gentleman called Doug Whiteway, the editor at Signature Editions. Since that time, it's been a process of us exchanging phone calls, manuscripts to clarify or to actually change certain things that they felt needed to be changed. This is a normal thing in the process. The editor is a somewhat more less biased reader of the manuscript and can pick out where the average reader would have problems. And therefore, there were some changes. It didn't require heavy editing, but we did make some changes. And I think the book ended up being better because of those.
It's like Aristotle says, you should begin your story where the story itself begins, where the action begins, not with a backstory, not with the history of the characters, but where the story you are telling starts.
You knock on every door, you answer every email, you look up all the publishers and what their requirements are, what their guidelines are.
My experience, I had a long-running column. I've had long-running columns, and I would send it every month, and they would send me money. And you kind of get used to that. So when you're on your own, sending out your stuff, and you don't have an editor to address, it makes it, it's kind of you have to flounder around for a while. It's sort of like you were off the Titanic, and the ring that you were holding on to disappeared. So the nice thing is if you're in a group of writers, if you're in a group of other people who are writing and publishing. So I think that's important. If you intend to publish, because a lot of writers don't intend to publish, they intend to write. They don't intend to publish. They're not even trying to get published. So if you're in a group of people who are publishing regularly, they say, oh, so-and-so told me about this market. And you'll have all the markets you want, and they'll say, well, this is the way to approach that editor. And you can find a group of people who do publish. And it really helps because they're getting published, and that eggs you on to get published too. So that's the kind of writers group you want. You want their intent to be serious, and you want them to be serious about their writing, that they're going to be writing all the time. They're not going to write something that they had 10 years ago and make that good enough. They need to be actively writing and trying to get published. I think if you're writing, you've got to be serious about it. And I think an awful lot of people who talk about writing aren't doing writing and aren't serious about where would they go. I mean, when you get down to the nitty-gritty, there's tons of markets out there. Anyone can get published. To get published in something that matters is another story. You begin to climb that ladder. And until you paid your dues by getting published in this little magazine and that little magazine and here and there, you really aren't looking for a book. I mean, the idea was, for a poet anyway, you didn't get a book until you'd been published several times. And I think that goes for a lot of writers. You know, you're paying your dues and you're figuring it out.
After you've been accepted by a publisher, some of them really seem to have a need to change things. They have to leave their mark on the manuscript. Some of them won't want to change much of anything. You can just give it to them.
We were very fortunate. We got some very good advice along the way, and that was to seek out a new agent in a well-established firm. And we did this, and we landed an agent fairly quickly. Now, it took him another year to find us a publisher.
You're going to have to look at what you've written, see for whom it might be a match. Does this look like a sort of brick books kind of book? Does it look more like a Coach House kind of book? So you're going to have some knowledge of the publishing scene out there, and where your stuff might fit. And then you have to try like heck. Publishers are not all wise, and editors are not magicians. They will look at your work, and sometimes they'll think it's better than it is. Sometimes they'll think it's worse than it is. They won't always make the right decisions. You're going to have to just roll with the punches and keep trying. Give the gatekeepers what they want, because you've got to get through the gate.
My first book, Coke, Stop and Emo, I paddled a canoe across Canada along the old routes of the voyageurs and fur traders, and wrote a book about it and took it to a publisher. Well, not quite ready-made. I took the idea to a publisher, and they were quite responsive right off the bat, so I was quite lucky that way. So that's an instance where I brought an idea to them, and they said go. And then, but the other books that I've done, they asked me to do them. The publisher phoned me and said, "Are you interested?" And I said yes. My two most recent books evolved in different ways. Walking in Hope, it's a short history of the Sisters of Providence, congregation of Catholic nuns that were formed in Kingston in 1861, and they're still here. They asked me through a mutual friend or someone who I know who worked for them. They learned of my existence. They were looking for someone to write this history, and I applied for that job, and they chose me. So that was a contract job, and that resulted in one book. On the other hand, my most recent one, which is called Kingston and Frontenac County, it's a coffee table book. John DeVisser is a photographer. Boston Mills Press contacted me, again, through the recommendation of someone else, and asked me if I'd be interested in doing this book. And I looked at their proposal, and I thought it looked really intriguing and possibly fun, and it was, and I'm quite pleased with the result.
There are probably as many different pathways to the publication of your book as there are individual people. We all find our luck in different ways. With myself, because I'm a genre writer, I, like many genre writers, like many fans of the genre, I go to conventions. And at conventions you meet other writers, you meet editors, you meet agents. And it was through those connections that I first got my agent, worked with him for on the first book, and he found the publisher. Of course, there's always a great deal of luck involved, but I feel that for me, as I say, the process has been very streamlined and almost easy, though you hesitate to use that word. I know other people have found things much more difficult.
I've done a lot of submissions over the years to all kinds of different places. And I've been published in quite a variety of places as well, such as Harrowsmith, the Malahat, the Wascana Review, the Great Stream Review in the States.
I bite off a little piece of my life, and then I send it off, and I usually get money for it. I don't always, but most of my life I have gotten money for what's happened in my life. I do write fiction, but basically the fiction's got to pretty well be something that really happened, because if it didn't really happen, unless I can convince myself that it happened, and then I can write convincingly.
I do have 2 books published, Knowledge in the Hands and Where Water and Gravel Meet, both books of poetry.
You might think that getting a second book published is easier than the first, and it isn't. Every book it has to stand on its own, unless you're someone like Dan Brown. So you have to, provide a continued level of performance and provide something the publisher is looking for. My first publisher published 2 of my novels. My third novel is published by a different publisher, and my mystery series will be published by someone else as well. And it has a lot to do with what especially with small presses, what their publishing needs are at that moment, what they have decided they're going to focus on. And many smaller publishers are publishing, between 4 and 25 books a year. So they don't have a lot of room for books. So you have to, you can't rest on your laurels, so to speak. You have to keep working and trying to make your next book better than your first one, and every book after that better than the one before.
You may have 3 or 4 books published, but maybe that your 5th book you're going to have to go back to doing cold calls as if you were a salesperson.
We were very fortunate with our second book. We got a contract from the publisher. But that said, it was a very, very different experience in the first book. I think with your first book, so much of your life up to that point goes into the book. Whereas with the second book, now it's like, okay, now I have to pull an idea out of the air, and where is that going to come from? And it was a very, very difficult book for us to write. It took us a very long time to find our story.
We asked some writers if they would tell us about that wonderful first time a manuscript was accepted.
I've submitted short stories quite regularly over the years. I'd say my first really big success was when I won the short story contest with the Kingston Regional Arts Council.
The first story I ever sold was a big deal at the time because I was in publishing and everybody in publishing was trying to get published, even though we were working in publishing. And I had written up My Honeymoon. In those days, we just had typewriters, so I had typed up My Honeymoon with as few typos as possible, and I decided to sell it to True Romance, and I did. It was called Married on the Mountain, and I got $165 for it from True Romance. But it took them forever, and I had to write them several letters before they responded and finally paid me for it. But all the girls in publishing were just so impressed. My God, I was a published author.
In the Dalhousie, there was a literary supplement to the Dalhousie student newspaper in the 1970s. It was sort of a wild poem spread out all over the page. It had something to do with opera and mowing the lawn and frogs and fate.
There's nothing quite like the experience of getting your first book published, and especially that moment where the publisher sends you your very first copy and you rip open the envelope and pull it out, and there it is, and it's the tangible thing that you've worked for years or months and whatever on. And it's, as a man, since I can't have a baby, having your first book is about as close as you can have to close as you can get to having an actual child. My first book, Coke, Stop and Emo, when I pulled this out of the envelope and saw it, I was just beaming, like an idiot, holding it and walking around and showing it to my friends, and I just couldn't wipe the smile off my face, because it's this, like when you have a baby for the first time, all of a sudden you're in the club of dads, and now I was in the club of authors, and I could put author beside my name and it would be legitimate, and it's a very nice feeling. It's never quite the same with the success of books, though. It's always most special with the first.
The first time I was published in book form was with this book, Knowledge in the Hands. I remember the acceptance letters saying that it would be published within 2 years. And at that time, I thought 2 years was an inordinate amount of time to have to wait. I've since learned that that is the window, usually.
I was still working outside of the house at that point, and my husband had come to pick me up from the office, and he was the one who told me. And I started crying in the truck because I was just so completely overwhelmed with the wonderfulness of it all.
Writers told us about persistence and rejection. It seems they need an awful lot of the former because they get really too much of the latter.
I started writing when I was 8 years old. I sent my first short story to the Old Star Weekly, written in pencil. It was rejected. I've had better luck since then.
I didn't have a lot of rejections, but the rejections that I had, I feel were nevertheless quite painful. I had a completed manuscript, for example, when I first approached my agent, who's the agent of my friends, and this is how I met him. And I thought it was pretty darn good. I thought it was pretty close to being a heartbreaking work of staggering genius. And I submitted it to him, and he read the first 100 pages and said, clearly you're a great writer, loved the characters, story sucks. And this was such a blow to me, like, not only because naturally I thought it was wonderful, but because I'd been working on it for so long. And the idea that it still needed work was so discouraging. And I don't think, oddly enough, that I actually thought I should stop, but I was tremendously discouraged and sort of put the letter away, came back to it 2 or 3 days later, read it over and went, oh, it's not as bad as I thought the first time around. Because, of course, by that time I was the more able to see the good things that he'd said. I went through 5 or 6 more drafts of that particular story. If you look at each of those drafts as a form of rejection, in the sense that my agent didn't like it and wanted me to rewrite it, well, yeah, I've had a fair amount of rejection in my time. I also have a PhD in English literature, and there is nothing that teaches you to deal with rejection, I think, faster than having a committee of 6 people tell you what's wrong with Chapter 7.
So I got my first handwritten rejection slip from Fiddlehead, which was really, and they always say something nice in them, and most slips are, like the Snoopy cartoon, most rejection slips are printed and don't really seem very interested in you. And I got one recently. I mean, everyone gets rejection slips, and you just have, one of the great things about writing is it teaches you very well to deal with rejection because you get so much of it.
I think some people give up too early. I think that persistence is important, and persistence in submitting is important. You learn a lot from the submission process. If you get any sort of encouragement at all, it means you're on the right track. And that sort of encouragement is, I like your story, try us with something else, that sort of thing, rather than simply a form letter with or without a signature. Anytime there's a comment made, it means that there's something they liked about what you did. And that's a great encouragement, because I could paper the walls of this room with my rejections.
I think the most important thing is persistence. You can't give up. You just have to keep sending your work out there. We got dozens of rejections, and we tried to take them very much to heart. We tried, at first you go, oh, what do they know? And our work is so perfect. But if that's the attitude, then it ends there. So we tried to take the rejections very much to heart, and to take out what we thought was important, and to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite, so that every time that it went out being a better manuscript. And sometimes these rejections would be incredibly conflicting. One would tell you, we love the writing, but the story doesn't catch us. Or the other one would say, great story, but the writing isn't all that good. So there were times when you just simply didn't know what to do with what you were hearing. But in time, it worked. We did find a publisher.
I give it a year. You send something out, and I give it a year. And after a year, you kind of nudge them. So I have had something at Fiddlehead for going on 2 years. And I decided it was time to nudge them a little more. So I sent them a second manuscript of poems, and I said, you lost my first one. Evidently you lost it because you never gave me back my stamped self-addressed envelope.
It's a matter of constantly pursuing the markets.
It's a learning process.
If you are a writer and you want to be a writer, you have a strange ego. It is absolutely necessary that, on the one hand, you be arrogant enough to actually expect total strangers to put out their spare cash to buy your books. This is not your mother or your cousins or your brother-in-law. These are complete strangers who will never meet you. You've got to be arrogant enough to think that your stuff is good enough to please those people. But at the same time, you have to be humble enough to accept reasonable, critical response from people like your agent, your editors. So if you don't have that arrogance, you're not going to proceed.
Money. Can they make a living at their craft?
In lieu of laughing hysterically, let me just be a little more serious and say that writing can be a very difficult row to hoe, as they say. It can be lucrative if you're Margaret Atwood or J.K. Rowling and you hit the jackpot with a blockbuster that everybody loves. But in general, it's a pretty tough way to make a living. It can be very satisfying, but I'm a freelancer. I have to scrape and claw for every job that I get. Most of them don't pay very well. I've been lucky a few times to break into some of the national magazines that do pay the top rates, But as I said earlier, you really can't say no to anything, so your workload varies wildly. You need to keep the checks coming in. A lot of people make ends meet by taking some other job. You know, they'll work in a restaurant, or they do something else, and they write on the side when they have the spare time. I've managed to resist doing that right now, although I don't know that my immediate family would agree that it has been the best life choice, but there you go. That's about all I can do, so I keep doing it.
Gina and I are a long way from making our living writing, but we persist, we dream, we hope, and we keep going.
One of the biggest misunderstandings on the part of the public is they think writers make money because they hear about the kind of deal that Stephen King makes or J.K. Rowling.
The average income for Canadian writers is, I believe, about $5,000 a year. If you're Dan Brown, if you're Stephen King, you make millions. But many writers, even writers who are quite successful, still work. For first novels, print runs can be as low as $2,000. So you're not looking at huge numbers here. My first novel made about $3,000 for me. Now, the money I received per copy was about 60 cents, because that's what it amounts to. And a lot of books, especially with first-time writers, a lot of books are done in trade paperback, which means that you're not getting the hardcover amount, which would be somewhat more.
You can't make a living at poetry in Canada, and you probably can't make a living at poetry in very many places in the world. I don't know, maybe Seamus Heaney makes a living at poetry, but not very many people anywhere in any era. It's just, sometimes I like to say to people, so in your monthly budget, you know, what's the part that you set aside for poetry? Probably zero. Okay, in your yearly budget, it's, even though some of us really like it, there's just not, the flow isn't enough. You can't dip your hands in the stream and come away with enough to support yourself. So you're looking at, you know, writing a best-selling novel, or teaching, or getting a job that might be totally unrelated to writing or books. That's the way it is.
You have to win major prizes or be a commercially very viable product to make a lot of money in writing.
Grants are important. Canada Council grants are very important. Ontario Arts Council grants are important. A manuscript of short stories, which I have presently, is only going to come into being if funding is there to give me time to write. And usually the funding works out to about $1,000 a month if you're very, very lucky.
Out of the hundreds and thousands of writers that there are in Canada, only 10 of them actually make a living writing. All writers understand that they're not going to make any money. I don't actually make enough money in the course of a year to say that I'm doing anything more than contributing to the household economy.
We asked writers, what was the most enjoyable part of the whole process for them?
When the book arrives in the mail and you open it and it's done and it's yours, that's rewarding. That's what makes it all very worthwhile.
I guess what I enjoy most about the writing process is the surprise that I have written a story perhaps to the 3/4 mark, and all of a sudden it achieves its own design, and it's that surprise, it's that discovery which is the most exciting part.
I must say that with my most recent book, I really enjoyed the editing process as well. It was great fun. Doug Whiteway, my publisher, or my editor, was a really, really good person to work with, and it was a fun process, something nice to do. If you're planning on getting into writing because you see it as being a way to fame and fortune, I wouldn't do it, because for the most part it's not. So you have to really enjoy what you're doing.
Well, I suppose I could always answer by referring back to one of the old writing cliches. You see it in lots of writing books, and that is the best part of writing is not the writing itself, it's having written. That is, when it's all over, then it can be kind of satisfying. But it's a nice thing seeing your name in print and seeing the work that you've worked so hard on for days or months actually appear and be read by people. That's quite a satisfying thing. But it's also just when you're in the room by yourself in your office staring at the computer screen and you crank out a couple of sentences that actually say what you want them to say in an elegant way. That's a really good feeling. And when you find that word that says exactly what you want to say, it's the le mot juste, the perfect word. That's a good feeling.
I think the best part for me is sharing my love of writing with students and with my colleagues, following my friends' careers and seeing their achievements is very rewarding. And knowing that those friends you are following are writer friends and their family. And it's a very, very special group of people.
Most days it's tearing your hair out, wondering why you do this. It's staring at a blank computer screen. And I guess, that also comes back to why I have a co-author. It keeps me going, keeps me encouraged. But there are those days where there's a good review, where an idea comes together, where something has happened that you feel is good in your writing. And those are the moments, I guess, that keep you going through the frustrating times.
There are some great parts. When you're standing in a bookstore doing a signing and somebody comes up, not only to buy the new book, but to bring to you the copies of the earlier books that they didn't get signed. That's a great thing. When a stranger stops you in a hotel that you're at a conference or at a convention, sees your name tag and stops you to tell you how much they loved your book, that's a great thing. But those things happen 2 or 3 times a year. You couldn't keep your morale up on that kind of thing. The absolute best thing, my favorite thing, happens when everything falls into place. I have the right scene with the right characters, with the right dialogue, and they're doing exactly the right thing, and the words just pour out. And you're not even aware of the passage of time, and suddenly it's just perfect.
The thing that keeps me going is the process, the daily discovery, and the learning that comes from the writing.
I actually enjoy research. I love to sit down and read about things and stuff my head. So that part of writing can be really enjoyable. Just finding out stuff that you didn't know. Or maybe you've gone and set your poem somewhere in a part of Canada that you hadn't been to, and well, now you better travel and make sure that it looks like what you thought it looked like. That part can be really fun.
Writing a book is such a painful, horrible experience in some ways that you need to be totally driven and compelled to tell this story in order to see it through. Otherwise, it'll never happen.
So where are we in the whole process? This manuscript has been put into shape. It's been accepted by a publisher. It's been published. Surely the hard work is all done now.
And once the book is published, your work doesn't end there, which is sometimes a bit frustrating because, of course, by the time your book is published, you're long on to your next book, and you keep being drawn back to this book that you haven't really thought about a lot in a while. You still have responsibilities to the publisher in terms of helping with publicity efforts, doing readings, sometimes doing mailings to let friends and colleagues know that you have published a book. If you're a big-time writer, you'll be sent on a tour. You'll be put on a plane and sent across the country to do readings at at various bookstores and other events, which isn't all the fun it's cracked up to be as far as I've been able to tell. It's not a part of the game that most writers like very much. And of course you have this vision of ending up on, well, back when Johnny Carson was Johnny Carson, that you would be on his show and etc. And of course that doesn't happen very often for any writer. But mostly you have to try to do, you know, the best you can to make people aware of your book.
Well, I can't say I have a great amount of experience doing the book tour thing, but on Coke Stop and Emo, my first book, it was sort of national in scope, and so the publisher sent me on a book tour, and that was great fun. Got to be a little, you know, a star for a few minutes anyhow, and got to go on Peter Zosky's Morningside show and the Deanie Petty show, and people recognized me in the street, and the publicists who ferry you around from interview to interview in each city are your own personal slaves, which is kind of fun. I didn't treat them that way, but that's their job. It's probably not one of the best jobs in the world, especially if the author happens to be an unpleasant person, but I'm not, so they had a good time. And then the tour ends and you come back to your house and life as a regular, real person begins once again.
One of the things that came as a big surprise to us as authors was how much work was left to be done when the book is published. There, of course, is publicity done by the publisher, but a lot of it is left up to the authors themselves, whether this is creating websites or sending it out to people that you think might provide you with reviews or publicity, visiting bookstores, you know, things on a very, very small level. And it's very time consuming, and it does keep you from working on the next project.
Once the book was published, there were radio interviews, there were readings. Some of these readings were formal, as book launches. Some were very lovely readings in a friend's living room with invited guests and lots of good food.
When my first book was published, for example, or rather when it was purchased, my agent said to me, Violet, have you got a website? If not, you know, get started on one. And I thought, what have I got to put on a website? But he was adamant that I begin putting things on a website, you know, where I was going to be going to do a signing, what conventions I was attending, you know, that kind of thing. Because that's where people look for their information now. They look to the internet. So writers now have to have a fairly high internet presence where they wouldn't have had to, as I say, 20 or 25 years ago. So that adds, if you will, to the burden of work, because a publicist isn't doing this for you. You have to do it yourself.
What if our writer has tried everything and he's always being rejected? What if that phone call or that acceptance letter never comes? What does a writer do then? There's always the road of self-publishing.
When someone comes in to have a book published, we deal with people who want to self-publish. Now, we can end up taking the manuscript that they have and do all the design, typeset it, supply proofs, and then print the final job. Or we can deal with a file that they've had a friend do or had done themselves, and from that file we're able to generate proofs and print the final book. Some people require a little more help. They need editing done from an editor. So the proofreading is done, the editing, check for sentence structure as well as spelling. That requires a little bit more work, and that's a specialty area where an editor would be hired. We would put the editors in touch with the author, and they would deal directly with them. And that should be done prior to having the artwork completed. You don't want to do the artwork first and then have someone tear it apart so that all that work goes to waste and you'd have to do it again. One of the decisions you have to make is the binding style. It could be a saddle stitch book like this one, so that you would have a stitch or a staple, as many people would call it, in the spine. But understand that when you do that, you always have to deal with multiples of 4, because the pages slide over that spine, forming a saddle. That's where the name comes from. If you're having something that's produced that has a small footprint area to be used in, like a cookbook, and needs to be folded over itself to fit on the counter, spiral binding, a plastic spiral like this, is the best method to use for that, because it can fold over onto itself as well as it will lay flat on the surface for use. If you're looking for a book that has a shelf presence, that you want to have a spine that shows, this method is called perfect binding, where all the pages are glued into the spine and then a cover is drawn onto it. It gives you a nice square spine and the ability to print on the spine. There are two ways you can print a book. One is using a digital printer, and the other way is a conventional printing press called offset printing. There's merit to both ways. One way that you would produce it, if it was, say, a digital job, would be for a short-run book, somewhere where you didn't need a lot of quantity. You try and use the equipment to the best of the ability of the equipment to reproduce the job properly, but at the same time economically. If you had a longer run, we would put it on a conventional printing press where we print multiple pages at the same time. So if you were to produce, say, 25 copies of a book, it would become a digital job. Right up until the break-even point would be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 300 to 400 copies, somewhere in that neighborhood, and then it makes more sense to have it put on an offset printing press. An offset printing press can print multiple copies quicker and use a larger format in the sheet, and therefore we can get more pages on at the one time, and that will reduce your costs over the run. If you're going to have your job printed on a digital printer, what happens there is a set rate for the pages that have to be printed. It declines very, very slowly, so that copy number 1 and copy number 25, there isn't a huge difference in the cost of the book. But if you're going to have it printed on an offset printing press, it's very much like a mortgage. The first copy costs you the majority of the cost, and it's amortized over the length of the run. So the more copies you get, the cheaper the unit cost becomes.
The library receives about 5 inquiries a month from self-publishing authors who are wanting us to acquire their material. We will review it, have a staff member look it over, decide if it's suitable to be added to the collection, and if so, we will send it for processing and add it to one of the library branches. This is a selection of material that's come in the last couple of weeks. Some of these have come by mail, and some of these have been dropped off by authors.
It's becoming increasingly more common for people to publish their own work. I'd say we probably see 3 to 5 new books a month, and about the only thing that I demand is that they actually look like a book, and that they can be favorably compared to other books that are on the shelf.
Some people will think that they can photocopy a few pages together and staple them, and that isn't good enough.
Now, as far as promoting individual books, it's really up to the author to do that. When I get a book in, I'll put it in the appropriate section.
If it's poetry, it'll go in the poetry section, and if it's self-help or history, it'll go in those sections. And then it just has to compete with all the other things in that section.
If someone has some kind of a promotional adjunct, like a display stand or a poster, we can work with that, and books can go in the window, but really that's about the extent of what we can do. Now, as far as the financial arrangements on a book go, the industry standard is 60% for the publisher, or the author in this case, and 40% for the store. But frankly, I'm not that rigid about these matters, because truly most of these books don't sell. If they end up selling very well, which some do, then we could have an absolutely firm contract with an author. But essentially, I don't mind if I get 25% or 30%, because there's no actual investment on my part. A lot of people don't understand how much work it is to have a book. Almost the easy part is writing it and getting it published, because once you have cases of books in your home, many people lose energy at that point, and they don't realize that there's a considerable amount of self-promotion is required. Authors should always carry a case of books in their trunk, just in case They can unload copies on the unsuspected public. There's an awful lot of money spent by publishers on promoting books. That in a way, that's why you want a publisher to get to publish your book. They have budgets for these things. You, as an author, won't necessarily have a budget for that, but it is an important thing to do. Once you've run out of family and friends, the public needs to know about your book. It's very difficult.
So we've seen how terribly difficult it is for a writer to get a manuscript published and actually sold. So why do they do it? Why do writers write?
I need to write my life. That's the impetus that I have.
My dad was a writer, and I grew up in that writer's milieu, and I found it appealing. So I suppose that's one answer. That's not the only answer. I guess I just always had an affinity for words and stories and books and so on. I always got the best marks in the class in English, and it was always kind of a given thing that Alec was going to be a writer. And maybe it was a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Because it's a way to be heard. I find in our present-day society that we have lost the art of conversation. We've lost the time for conversation, and that largely writing allows the talk to go on.
When it comes to being a writer, the fun is the writing. It isn't the publicity, it isn't any of that. The fun's in the writing. And certainly you hope to get paid for it.
On the good days, it's easy to know why you write because things are going well and you're happy with your work. But then there are the days that one just can't imagine why one would put themselves through this. And I think with both books, both The Sidewalk Artist and Ciao Bella, that there was a point at which both of us, thought we would never write again. This is it. We'll finish this book and that's it. We'll go on to find something else to do with our time. But then once the book's in your hand again, or you've had a good day, then it's on to the next project, and those ideas come to you and you just feel that you have to run with them.
The simplest answer has to be, I can't not write. I look around and I drive my husband crazy because, something will happen on the radio and somebody will say something, or, some idiot will pull in front of us. And my husband will say, why do they give that man a license? Well, I've got 7 answers for that question. I can tell you 7 more reasons of why he pulled in front of us at that time. I do nothing but tell stories all day long. So you know what? I've got to turn that into something that will justify my existence, make me some money, give me structure to my life.
I just enjoy the process of researching a story and then putting it down and laying it out for other people so that they can enjoy it too.
Perhaps we write because we like it. Maybe it just feels good.
All very good reasons. But what about new writers? We went to a creative writing class at St. Lawrence College, and we asked the students there why they wrote.
I write in order to convey information.
To hear voices, hear improv in my head.
Because I have a lot inside and words are the only tool I have to express it.
Because I have thousands of stories that seem to me to be worth telling, and time to just do a few.
Because I have a desire to create something where somebody who I've never met could enjoy it and hopefully someday maybe even be inspired by it.
Because I have a story in me that I want to get down on paper.
Because sometimes I love to and sometimes I hate to. And I learn from it always.
When I'm reading all my favorite authors, I think to myself, I can write that. I could write better than that.
Because I need the balance it brings me.
I write because I have to.
No matter why writers write, I'm glad they do, because so many of us wouldn't want to do without our books. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I'll read my book.